too much. Oh no, this is mine.
I'm gonna use that one.
This is
All right. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. So first of all, I just want to say thank you very much for honoring me by being here. And not only that, but honoring the subject matter itself. I'm really grateful at the fact that you've taken out your weekend to give me the opportunity to express some of my ideas and thoughts on Ottoman history. So those of you who don't know, I mean, I wasn't an Ottoman historian. I was I did business computing. So I actually went into STEM. But I was living in Syria, and one of the interesting things I noticed in Syria was the visibility of the Ottoman past, but an attempt to hide the Ottoman past by the various nation states in the Arab world, which caught my attention a little bit. I found it surprising in that sense. And one of the things that I noticed consistently, so when I lived in Damascus, there was a market called Suq al-Hamidiyya, which is Hamidiyya market. And the street opposite it was called Shariat Midhat Pasha, which was the Grand Vizier of Abdul Hamid at the time. So I found that intriguing, that there are still roads and streets named after the Ottomans in that sense. And there was a giant coffee shop that I used to go to, which was the Hijaz railway station. And I was so disappointed to see the railway station be a coffee shop in that sense. So that things like that piqued my interest. And then I studied in Turkey and so on. And what was intriguing for me is I had, just like most of you here, an immense interest in Islamic history and Ottoman history. And I was disappointed in myself that I didn't know. That was my frustration. How comes I didn't know this? Why didn't I know this? Why did I not study it? And then I would speak amongst my friends and who are Muslim and so forth. And I'd ask them, like, listen, I've read this book and what do you think? And they said, we don't know. So that became an issue of concern for me. So I decided to do a master's to see whether it was necessary or relevant to do Ottoman history. And I still remember very clearly in the class that I was in, my master's class, I was the only Muslim there. There was one Turkish girl, but by and large, I was the only Muslim. And then, 6-7 years later, when I started my PhD, there was a running joke in my university. He's the Muslim Ottoman historian, because there was nobody else. Turks were doing it, but what was interesting is the majority of the Turks that were learning or studying Ottoman history was under the basis of something related to Turkey. They live in Turkey, that's their home. Ottoman history is a staple in Turkey. We have a joke that everybody's an Ottoman historian in Turkey. You get into a taxi and someone will talk to you about it and whatnot, right? But my frustration predominantly was how comes we as Muslims are disconnected from this? What's happened? It was a 600-year blind spot. And that is phenomenal to have a 600-year blind spot in that sense. Because if you have a blind spot that large, how do you make sense of the world you live in? How does that work? How is that possible that we have such a large gap in our memory? So then I did the PhD and I moved to Turkey. And what was interesting is the way that Ottoman history was being taught in Turkey was quite different than the way Ottoman history was being taught at my university in England. And I started to notice, okay, we have a situation here. And as a Muslim, as a religious Muslim, right, and I don't apologize about that, I had a lot of challenges doing Ottoman history. I was mentioning to some of these guys the other day that I remember speaking to one of my professors, and I was quoting an alim in my PhD, and I quoted it as Allah says in the Quran. He says, you can't write that. I said, why not? He goes, well, no, you have to change it. I said, change it to what? He goes, you have to write the Quran says. So then I got frustrated and I said, okay, but who's the author? And he went, don't do that. I said, no, you need to understand, I'm going somewhere with this. Who's the author of the book? Because usually when you footnote something, you put the author of the book. So how do I footnote this? And he just, TQM would be sufficient, or the Quran, that's it. So it's very strange and interesting that just the name of the book turns up, so it's missing. So I said to him quite politely, I said, you took my relationship with the book away from me. He goes, I didn't do that. I said, yes, you did. It's not that you did it, the academia did it. And so I started to realize that as a Muslim who went into academia, when I was doing Islamic history, I was feeling disconnected even when I was writing it, because the connection wasn't allowed to be made. So Islam, in that sense, I started to learn very quickly in Western academia, was designed where Islam was an object and they were trying to conceptualize it. And for me, it was a lived tradition. So now we have a situation, right? So how do we make sense of that? So one of the things I started to notice more and more is that, okay, how does this work? What am I going to do? One, I can continue to be an academic and write in the academic way and be accepted as an academic, and that's not a problem. And then I could create an alternative space for Muslims. Or two, I could try to challenge the academia or try to instill Islam into my work and force them to accept things. So I give you an example. I was putting Hijri dates in my PhD. And my supervisor goes, 1324, well, what date is that? I said, figure it out. And he goes, can you not just put the real date? I said, it's 1908. But why should I have to put 1908 down? Why can I not put down 1324? And I do this joke all the time. I'm not going to do it today, but I'll write like Hijri dates on the wall. Even I don't know them, to be honest, but I'll write them and I'll ask people, well, what year is that? And people don't know. The fact that we've lost that calendar. My mum and dad have Islamic calendars every year that they buy from the masajid that has Hijri dates on it, but nobody looks at it, right? Actually, the Muslims are still insisting on putting it there so you don't forget, but nobody looks at it. So the point I'm making is that I was in a field of academia where you're seeing things being stripped away from you, right? And you don't realize because it becomes normalized. And so when something is not there, or when something is written in a different way, you internalize that and you forget what belongs to you. And that's what I started to notice, that Western academia, yes, for many people, it might be neutral and so forth, but it had a capacity of power when it spoke and wrote and presented itself in a particular way, which was not helpful for Muslims studying Islam in that space. That was the challenge, right? So that's the problem I had. So I said, okay, we need to try to conceptualize this. We need to at least warn Muslims a little bit so that they can have some level of agency. I'm no longer interested in trying to change the opinion of Western academia. I fight with Western academics all the time, okay? And I've made this very clear. I was at a conference once and a guy critiqued me and I said, you wouldn't tell a black person what it means to be black. You wouldn't tell an LGBT person what it means to be LGBT. Don't tell a Muslim what it means to be a Muslim. I'm not going to accept that from you anymore. I'm the authority here, not you. And that's important, that you have to have some level of agency of writing about your own past. You have to take it back, you have to reclaim it, right? So that's what I was trying to do. So anyway, I'm going to jump in between being casual and a little bit technical at times. And if you don't understand what I'm saying, just tell me and I'll stop, all right? All right, we ready? Good stuff. All right, let's go. So that's going to catch me for now, right? Okay, you got me. So the first thing that I realized was that in terms of understanding knowledge, you have to have an understanding. Okay. Right. So the first thing I realized is in terms of understanding knowledge, you have to understand where that knowledge is coming from, the basis of that knowledge, because knowledge isn't neutral. Okay. The idea that the information you're getting is neutral is not true. It's coming from a basis of something. So the first thing I learned, and I'll just do this like this so you can see it. All right, do it like that so you can see. All right, so I sort of like started to think about these ideas in this way. Your knowledge or that you're learning is built on something. It comes from a particular space, right? Where your knowledge is coming from, fundamentally, is your aqidah, okay? It's your creed. The reason why I've written it in Arabic and in English, because actually they have different meanings, and that's also important. Your knowledge comes from the creed that you believe in, right? For us as Muslims, and I always say this, your shahada is an indication of your creed. Okay, it's an indication of that. Your knowledge comes from that. It was for that reason that the shahada was so important. And I say to my students all the time, ashhadu, what does that mean? And they go, oh, we're starting with the first word? So yeah, what does it mean? Explain to me, what did you see? We didn't see anything. So you're shahid of what exactly? Yeah, actually here it means I'm a person of knowing. I know. Know what? La ilaha. Okay, so your aqidah, your shahada in of itself is already telling you, and you're already testifying that this is something that you know. Okay, what? La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah, or ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasul. Now, the reason why this is important, because you are recognizing with a negation, la, that there's certainty here. Like if I said, you want tea? No. Are you happy? No. There's certainty. Your shahada starts with a certainty that there is nothing worthy of worship but Allah. Okay, abduhu. Rasul Sallam is abduhu, so I am abduhu. To be an abd, abada, ibadah, it's the same root word. So the purpose, your purpose in this dunya is to worship Allah Ta'ala. And then wa Rasuluh, okay? The message that he brought in that sense. So our knowledge is then predicated on that. Okay, the basis, not just scientific knowledge, all knowledge. Now in the West, they reject that. Allah is not important. So already we're starting to see the rejection of this main point means that the knowledge base is already going to be different. It's coming from a different space now. So your intention of learning the knowledge is going to be different. So here, the point I'm trying to make to you then is that what we're trying to say is your knowledge is dependent on your aqidah. It's dependent on it. It has to agree with it. And if it doesn't, then we have a situation. So as a historian, I started to notice that what I was learning in university as an academic was not at times acceptable for my aqidah. How do I work with this? What do I do now? Right? And I had to keep making these divot points and compromises and adjustments. Now, the knowledge comes from your aqidah, and then what your knowledge does, or here I wrote the word ilm, because actually ilm is different, all right? And once again, I'm going to talk about language later, but I want you to understand here already why I'm using these words. Because here, when you say knowledge, it still sounds quite secular. And the minute you say ilm, it doesn't. So already you can see in our tradition, in our culture, that even the words we are using are submitting to the aqidah in that sense, right? In that sense. All right. So the point I'm making is your knowledge has to submit to Allah Ta'ala, right? In that sense. All right. And your knowledge, it shapes your worldview. The knowledge you learn shapes the way you see yourself in the world that you're in, right? In that context. So what's happening here in Western academia, there's an aqidah, which is basically freedom, liberty, equality, all of these sort of things. Allah Ta'ala is not important. Your religion is not important. Put that to a side. So already from here, we're pushing something which is secular. It's coming from the basis itself. All the knowledge that's coming from here is secular. And then the worldview is shaping is one which is a secular worldview. Whether you know it or you don't. Whether you're an active participant or a passive one, you're being shaped by this. So imagine you're reading this every day. Imagine that's all you're reading. So the way that you understand yourself then is coming from this perspective. You take zero meaning as a Muslim. Well, not zero, but very limited meaning as a Muslim in this context. So I started to struggle, okay? It's no wonder then that when I was reading works in Western academia that they were speaking about Muslims as if they were speaking about some guy that they met in the bar in the pub. He did this, he killed that guy, he was drinking alcohol, he was having relations. What's going on here? This doesn't make sense. The reason being is what? Worldview. You belong to a particular worldview. You only understand the world from that worldview. And so then when you look at other human beings, you see them from that perspective. And then that's how you write about it. So you see yourself as somebody who's a secular agent, who does A, B, C, and D. You say, of course, if I do that, they must have done that too. And so what you start to see is that this worldview internally had assumptions. And the assumptions are made from the fact that it's coming from this perspective, right? And I had a problem with that. I said, that's not how I see the world. And I still remember one time I was in an academic conference and I was talking about the ulama, and one guy goes, but you do know they lie, right? And I smiled. I said, I know human beings lie. I'm not an idiot. But have you ever met an alim? He went, no. So they fear Allah. You know that? He goes, how can you prove it? Because I fear Allah. My worldview is different from yours. The assumption that you made is that people lie, cheat, steal. Those religious folk also do that. The assumption I made, from my experience, is it's possible they do that. I know that. But there are many who fear Allah too. You know why? Because I fear Allah. And they are better people than me. And I don't need the empirical data to prove that to you. So often what you will see in academia is the empirical data is not necessary at times. It's not there. There's continual ingrained assumptions. And so what they do is they create a narrative. Okay? They start to create a narrative about peoples. They look at peoples, assuming they are objective, because that's what secularism does. The suggestion is we are objective, we are viewing everything else, and they make the assumption that they have the right, as a way of being secular, that they are not, they are impartial. But if you replace this, if you replace Islam to this, it's not impartial. It's still opinionated. It's a particular form of opinion. There's no neutrality here, okay, in that sense. And this is where the problem is. So I want to highlight this to you so that, because I said this yesterday, I want you to start to become knowledge producers. We've all become knowledge consumers. And at the moment, alhamdulillah, we've got to a stage where we have so much knowledge available that we can just consume Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, books, literature, no problem, movies. But the production end is not on the same level of equilibrium. We need to change that. So I want to highlight this to you. Why? Because once you start to become knowledge producers, you need to understand that what are you producing this knowledge for? What's the point? And I know many Muslims will go into academia with this in mind and they'll become great academics, and that's fine. That's your day job, that's your career, you're going to write books and so forth, but just be aware that the book you are reading, from the space it is coming from, it doesn't give Islam a fair trial. It is, and I say this openly, it may be sympathetic to Muslims, but it's antagonistic towards Islam. Okay, and I know many young Muslims who go to Western academic schools and then feel agitated. They feel confused. They don't know. And it's very difficult because everything that you are learning, the whole knowledge base that you have, you can't resonate with it. It makes no sense to you. So this is what we're trying to change, right? In this context. All right, do you guys have any questions so far? We're okay? Pretty cool. It's not that radical. Alhamdulillah. You know. At one time I was teaching this in my class in the Ilahiyat, and we had some non-Muslim Erasmus students, and my students were freaking out. They said, oh, teacher, don't do that. And I was explaining to them, it's funny, I said, when I go to university, there can be 100 Muslims and one non-Muslim professor. He still sticks to his secular vision. But if I give a Jummah khutbah and one non-Muslim appears, I have to then start making adjustments and get nervous. What's going on here? Already they're inside your mind. Don't worry about it. I'm a Muslim. I know how to speak. You'll be fine. This is universal. Don't feel. So what you realize is this: here, it's power. Okay. Now, the challenge we have as Muslims is you have this, and when you're a young child, sorry, I drew him as a male, but that's universal for now. You live in a world where being non-binary is a bit of a problem, but let's just pretend that's a man. And they enter the world. When they enter the world, you're a child, you're a baby, you don't have any opinions, but the minute you start to get older, this worldview is already shaping you. You're being contaminated by it already. So as your kids are growing up, they're watching TV, the politics, the news, the cartoons, the movies, the internet, the Twitter, the worldview, it's shaping them, right? And what we say is that they are learning from osmosis, their environment, without even knowing. And this is a challenge that the parent has, because the parent is trying to actively intervene in that. In that sense, this is half the challenge. So the point I'm explaining this to you is that you need to know this, that just because your kids are going out and about and you're sending them to madrasa, Quran, and so forth, they're still being contaminated by the water that they are drinking, right? There's a hadith of Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, he says, when the man went into the sea, he will get wet. You can't escape your environment. So then this is why in Islam, they came up with the idea of Iman versus Kufr, right? This idea, here I'm talking about intellectual challenge, an ideological one or a religious one, that there's a world of Iman and there's a world of non-Islam, right? And you have to be actively aware of that, okay? That you're a Muslim and you're a person who belongs to Iman. And that every single day, every human being is challenging, whether it's their nafs or the dunya, with the world of kufr, okay, in that sense, and that's hard. And academia is not the world of Iman. That's the challenge that the kids are having. That's the difficulty. So you need to be aware of that. So the point I'm trying to make is we need to change this, that the knowledge you are producing, so the ulama, Al-Ghazali, Taymiyyah, Mawardi, Abu Hanifa, what were they writing from? Iman. When you read their books, you read their works, they're talking to you as Muslims directly. Iman. But academics don't. So what I'm saying to you is I'm aware of this, right? So when we're doing Islamic history, when you're reading Islamic history, you have to be aware of this complexity. So I wanted to introduce you to this before I started anything about Ottoman history, because people always ask me, teacher, what books can we read? And I sort of raise my eyebrows. The whole thing is a bit contaminated because we don't write Islamic history. We don't do it. Academia writes it for us. And so then you become dependent. And here, the reason why I told Aqidah, knowledge, worldview, it doesn't matter if this person is Muhammad. He's still affected by this. Okay? He could be a good religious Muslim, no problem. But he's writing from this. And because he or she is writing from this, they are impacted by that worldview. They are forced to write in a particular style, a particular way. They have very little agency where they can intervene. When they do, it's a constant battle, constant struggle. That when they're producing works, young kids, when they pick it up, or even adults, they're still, it's an Aqidah that's not Islamic. This is the challenge. So we need to find a way of writing works that are helpful for Muslims from the Islamic perspective. And that's the shift I'm asking you to start making now, okay? You want to go to university, that's fine, no problem. You want to send your kids to university, that's not a problem. They want to study history, unfortunately, that's the best place they can learn history. But they have to be aware of this, of what you're reading. And I tell you why, my teacher used to tell me all the time that books are powerful. They get inside your head. You have a conversation with the author, they shape you, they influence you, right? So the books that are being produced in Western academic circles are shaping our students who are studying there. And it happens to me all the time when I'm talking to a person at Princeton, Harvard, Yale, and they'll speak to me and they'll speak like an academic. And I say, you can't speak in the masajid like that. No one's going to accept you. No one's going to understand. Have you forgotten how to talk to Muslims? And they'll be like, oh, how do I make this palatable for Muslims? They think, okay, we're Muslims, how do we do this? So I wanted to explain this point in that sense. Before I wipe it down, do you guys want to say anything? No? Okay? Good stuff? Alhamdulillah. Put that down quickly. No.
I'll say something.
Thank you very much, sir. I really appreciate it.
Assalamu alaikum wabarakatuh.
When I was in my madrasa, my imam used to make me clean the floors with my fingers. We had a hoover. And it was funny because in some universities, when I used to arrive in the room, the board used to have stuff on it. And my imam always used to say, the teacher that was there before you didn't respect you. They should have cleaned the board before he left. And then the other teacher goes, but the student should have done it. You know, I know. I'm just okay. If I speak too quickly, please let me know. I'm from England. I get excited sometimes. Yes. Sure you can. Right. It's all right, I'll repeat the question for them. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's not easy when they're young, right? Yeah, exactly. Right. Right. I mean, for many of us, to be honest, the world is not black and white. And actually, we are. The reason why I'm explaining this, and I should have made it clearer. Thank you. I should have made it clearer is that we are navigating both spaces. On many occasions throughout history, we have navigated those both spaces, right? But when your canopy is Islam, it's easier to navigate that space. What I mean by canopy, I'll take this mic as well, actually. I'm going to go back onto the board. I just have to do it once. You know, when I was in Tokyo, there was a woman waving. I thought she was waving at me, and I looked behind her, someone else. I'm always nervous about waving randomly. I got so excited because in Tokyo, nobody says hello to you. And there was one person waving. I thought, okay, finally, someone's going to say hello, but nope. Story of my life. Okay. What was I saying? Right. Okay. So at the moment, the environment we're in at the moment is this. You have a secular world, and religion has its place. It has to be in a box. Hinduism, Christianity, Judaism. You fit into a box. Secularism says, I'm going to referee these religions, keep it equal. That's how we survive. Now, so when you practice your religion, you are practicing it, but you're still actually fundamentally occupied by that. In the Ottoman period and in Islamic history, that was Islam. So even though people were Christians and Jews and so forth, when I've gone to the Arab world, because I lived there for a long time, even Christians understood Islam, the values of Islam, the ideas of Islam, because they lived under it. So if Islam is not the canopy that everyone fits under, and if Islam comes here, and you're looking at the secular world, you go into a box. And the only thing you're then thinking about is, how do I survive? When you're in that box, right? So as a Muslim minority in England, we're only thinking about surviving as a minority, protecting ourselves as a minority. How can we live in this area as a minority? How can I pray salah, eat halal food, and so forth? But if your canopy was Islam, it'd be a lot easier. So the challenge then becomes greater. Because you're in this box, you're fighting something which is larger. That's hard. So what I say to you in that sense is, you have to actively be involved with your kids to continuously be on them. Because the minute you let up, the world is not going to stop for you. The minute they go outside, the world is not going to care that you stopped today. The minute you take a breather, the phone doesn't care. So what you're fighting against is, as I said, this large canopy in that sense, as Muslims who are living in the West, in that sense, right? So as a result of that, it requires an even harder active effort to continuously be on top of it. And that's tough. And we all have our emotional challenges. We all have our difficulties. And when I said Iman and Kufr, even for me, I wake up every morning with a struggle. And this is where then, alhamdulillah, for us, we have Quran. And I always say to my young students, make the Quran their companion, okay? Make Allah their best friend. Make them turn to Allah. He's the one who will protect them. And I say this to children. When they're kids, I always say to my friends, you don't have to give them intellectual stuff. Make sure it's, even if it's emotional, that they're attached to their creator. So that if they try to move away from it, it feels uncomfortable. And then as they get older, you give them layers and layers and layers of knowledge. And if you don't have that knowledge, then we go to try to find people who do, and so on, right? And this is why now I'm saying we have to be in the process of knowledge production, because our young and youth, the knowledge that they are reading is not coming from us. And we have a deficiency in knowledge producers. And there's only so many teachers you can give them. So they have to have access to this knowledge that can help them, but they also have to be in an environment. So that's the key, right? Is that okay? Okay. But the honest answer to your question, it's hard. And this is a test of being in this moment. And I've said this before, this is an exceptional test from Allah Ta'ala. This is an exceptional moment in history. But during exceptional tests, exceptional people come from it. So I do believe that from our ummah, there will be exceptional people. I do believe that.
Assalamu alaikum. I do have
You don't have any questions, so I go on to the next step?
Assalamu alaikum.
I'm there for time. I'm all right? Okay, good stuff. All right.
Oh.
Did any of you guys watch Karate Kid? The wax on, wax off? I feel like I need a Mr. Miyagi. I'm using the paint stick. Okay. Okay, Bismillah. Yeah. All right, so the next thing I wanted to teach you then was that when we teach history in the West, it's linear. Okay, actually, it's not even linear. It's like that. We're progressing. We're going up. What that does under modernity is it makes you believe that this moment is better than this moment, and this moment is better than this moment. Right? That's what it's doing. So continuously you're going forward. The problem is that we as Muslims don't look at ourselves in the dunya in this way. Why? Here, it's the time of Rasul Sallam, and if I'm here, yes, I am looking forward, but I'm also looking back. That past is important to me. It's a repository. I take from that. I take meaning from that, and I have to continuously take from that. But not only that, throughout Islamic history, I've got to keep going back into the repository. What did Muslims do? How did they survive this point? Insan is the same. When they were struggling, how did they come out of it? So on, right? Now, the reason why I'm explaining this to you is because I was watching, transition felt smooth. I was watching George Martin from Game of Thrones, right? He had an interview with Stephen Colbert. And he was talking about in the 1970s in America, when the man went onto the moon, they thought, okay, we made it. After the moon, we're going to go to Mars, into space. Blah, blah. That's the pinnacle of progress. Keep going forward. And what was interesting when he was talking about this progress, I was listening to him carefully. He says, this is where Star Wars came from. This is where Star Trek came from. This is where Terminator 2 came from. Back to the Future. They were imagining the future from their perspective of progress because they believed we're going forward. Okay. And then what happened is they stopped going to the moon. The progress stopped. And he started to think, well, what's after this? So then Colbert asked him, do you have a crisis of faith? And I found it interesting because he's not a Christian. He's a person who believes in science. And he goes, yeah, sort of. I can't see where the future is anymore. And he started to talk about a dystopia, that the nuclear bombs will kill people. The Russians have gone to war with Ukraine. The world is going to end tomorrow. The chaos in their mind. Because progress at one point was making them think they're improving and improving and improving. But now, this idea of progress is problematic. Progress to what exactly? What is the end goal? What is your purpose? Why are you here? They don't know. So then you start to see that the idea of progress is holding them down, right? It's making it challenging for them. Now, we as Muslims, we don't see the world as linear, okay? The akhirah is attached to your history. this dunya is just a moment when you're here. And the reason why I'm explaining this is because while you don't have to write like that as a historian, but still you have to be aware of that. In this sense, when we say, like, inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raj'un, it's circular. You came from Allah Ta'ala. You return to Allah Ta'ala. It's not flat. I say to people, when you read the Quran, there's no beginning, there's no end. The Quran is not linear. That's teaching you something about your tradition. When you look at the ideas of Ibn Khaldun, he's talking about a circle, right? Indicating that there's up and down, up and down. Continue moments the Ummah have achieved something. And this is important then to place yourself differently, because when I start to write with the intention that the Akhirah is part of your history in terms of your timeline, then you start to understand that as Muslims, we see time differently. Time is very different from us than it is in the way, and the reason why I explain this to you, because even the way history is written, it shapes the way people conceptualize time, right? In this sense, in the Ottoman context, when they made clocks, it's very interesting. So before, Muslims never had watches and clocks and phones and so forth, right? So you'd say to someone, I'll meet you at Salat al-Fajr. I'll meet you at Isha time. There's a flexibility. Somebody would come to your house, knock on your door. You didn't even know he was coming. Take a seat. WhatsApp, I hate WhatsApp. Like here now at the moment in the States, I've got everybody from Turkey and England. Can you do this article? Can you finish this? And I'm asleep. And it's like somebody just poking me when I'm talking to somebody else, because there's no concept of time anymore, right? And in Islam, we have a very different concept of time. The clock not only changed the way we told the time, it changed our perception of time. Before, like I said, I'd meet you at Salat al-Dhuhr. Now it's I'll meet you at 7:54. You start work at 9, you finish at 5. So before, where your world evolved around your ibadat, now your ibadat evolves around your world. It's been a shift in the way that we see time. And I was telling some of the students before that when I say Salat al-Maghrib, that's not the name of the Salah. That's the name of the time. Okay? It's time that Allah Ta'ala is talking about. And Allah makes promises on time. And I always say to my students, don't waste my time, because you can't give it back to me. Once it's gone, it's gone. Because in Turkey, people are late all the time. You get used to that, right? And I try to explain to them how important time is as a commodity, because you don't know how much you have. You don't know, right? And I'm giving you this long-winded answer about time. Why? Because as historians, one of the most important things as a concept that's important for us is the notion of time. Because we write about time. This happened at this time. And this time is linked to this time. And this time is linked to that time. And this, right? And what you want to do as a person, oh, I don't have to do that anymore. I don't need to do that, okay? Is you are here, and you need to place yourself in this timeline. Where do you fit? And in the idea of progress in the West, you are the best people because everyone else is behind you. We don't believe that as Muslims. And what's interesting is, in the West, I told you, they were imagining the future. It gave them the idea of progress to start imagine what the future could be like. But our future is not restricted to this dunya. This is why Allah Ta'ala gives you imaginations of Jannah. He's told you what the future is going to be like. That is the future in that context, right? But here, the notion of progress actually doesn't talk about the future. It's a constant present. Okay, it's a constant present. And so the reason why I'm explaining this last point to you is because history is as much about the present as it is about the past. Okay, I was saying this to the guys yesterday. I always know, how people feel based on the questions they ask me. When they ask me a question, it's not about the past. It's about now. When they ask me the question, how can we take pride in our history? I say, this is not about taking pride in Fatih or Abdul Hamid II. This is, how do you feel now? You feel a lack of pride now. And so you're saying to me, is there something I can look to in the past? So the questions are telling you something in that context. So history and history writing, we as historians know is continually about the present. Okay? Continually about the present, because the past is so vast that when you're doing research, you need to ask yourself, what is it that you want to know about the past? And the things that you want to know about the past are relevant to how you're living now. You don't write about things that are irrelevant to you. You want to write about things that you want to know, right? So that's just why I'm saying that when you're doing history, you have to be quite solid in your aqidah. And this is why I raised the issue of aqidah, because Muslims did do messed up things. That doesn't change my aqidah. I'm still Muslim. Doesn't matter. And I'm aware of the mistakes we have made, but I'm also aware of our achievements. And once you know that, once you give your kids a good grounding in aqidah, it doesn't matter what they read of the past. It doesn't shake their foundations. But if their foundations are weak and they go into academia and they're studying the history books and their professors saying, Muslims did this, 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 and this, you're kind of crazy, just like us. The Muslims thinking, okay, then what does it mean to be Muslim? How am I different? I'm not different. Then what's the point? Then why am I doing this? Then what I have is just a religion. Well, lots of people have religions. So why do I need to practice it so aggressively? Right? So this is why this then becomes important. And so going back to your point, I think that is important. That I think what's missing in many of our children, it's not our fault. The foundations have to be tight. And the issue of knowledge, and I learned this about history as well, is your memory keeps forgetting, which you're supposed to. And even the most basic things, you forget. So you got to keep reminding. And this is why we were talking the other day about tasbih. Why are we keeping doing tasbih over and over? Why do people keep doing dhikr of Allah Ta'ala over and over? Because people forget. I remember just recently in Turkey 2 weeks ago, I was praying salah and I went wal asr, and then I forgot. And I'm standing there for 5 seconds and the jama'ah behind me is quite kind. They were waiting and then somebody said it. And then I was like, you know, because I was tired that day. You forget, it happens. It sounds really strange because it's so embarrassing. It's something basic, but that's how human memory works. It forgets. We forget. Insan forgets. This is why when Allah Ta'ala, in the term with Rasul Sallam, when he says, Iqra bismi rabbika allazi khalaq, khalaqal insana min alaq, Iqra wa rabbuka al-akram, allazi allama bil kalam. What is he saying to Rasul Sallam? He's saying that I created insan from this. He's actually telling insan, have you forgotten who it was that did this? Because insan forgot. Because surely Adam alayhi salam knew. Did Adam alayhi salam not know? Did he not tell his children? Did insan not know of this knowledge? They knew of it, but they forgot. So Allah Ta'ala had to remind them in the Quran again, remember who did this. That insan is supposed to forget, but this is the key then. So in terms of writing, the power of writing is that when insan forgets, they can turn to something that they can read that reminds them. But if the things that are being written are not being written by you, and they're being written by someone else about you, for you, your children will remember things about themselves that's not from them. That's not from them. That's not right, as far as I'm concerned. Forget Ottoman history. Like this session, I know is not about Ottoman history, but I'm trying to just give you these foundations so you understand like the challenges we have as academics, right? The challenges we have being in academia in this context, because when you're constantly reading something, it's shaping your memory. And they're telling you who you are, who you were, and who you ought to be on this timeline, right? And that's what we need to change. Time for a break? You go for it.
So the question is about history writing. When you read like Islamic classical sources, it's very different from the way history is written today.
Right.
Generally, older history books are very hard to read. They're just report after report. It's reporting with very little reflection or analysis. Modern history writing is very different. When did that shift take place? Is it a Western versus Eastern thing, or is there a similar shift within our tradition? And I guess the earliest sort of analytical history comes to mind is Ibn Khaldun.
That's right.
But he's very recent. That early.
So Ibn Khaldun is actually the turning point, where Khaldun was very critical of our ulama in the way that they were writing history. Not only was he critical of them, he was critical of the students. So he would say sometimes the ulama would use references as a way of exaggeration to make a point, and people took that literally. And then his critique was interesting. He said, and the ulama should know the languages that they are using of the different societies, and they're not. And what's interesting about in any of the Western universities, they're teaching you various languages. so that you can have tools. And Muslim kids generally don't have those language tools, right? So history writing is actually a 19th century phenomenon that comes from Western Europe in that sense. We were not writing history like this, you're right. We were very descriptive in the way we write. In fact, we're still writing in very descriptive ways. That's fascinating. Why? Because Muslims are very good storytellers. We have the oral tradition in that sense, but something has been lost in the way that we started to document our past. And that could be because we went through various traumas. The Mongol invasion of Baghdad, the Muslims being kicked out of Andalusia, and so the continued traumas of centers of learning that were creating particular ways of talking about people. By the time we get to the 19th century where the world becomes global, that vision is not there. Now the Ottomans do write books about history actually, but nobody reads Ottoman Turkish. So that's another thing, that's a bit of a problem. And actually language, now that you mentioned it, let me talk to you one point about that. I have time? Okay. Okay, language is really important. Okay, you guys might have seen this before, I've done this before, but it's a little magic trick. So one of the interesting things about Quran is Quran was Allah Ta'ala's word. Okay, there was an Arabic before Quran, and then when Quran came, it influenced Arabic. Arabic totally submitted to Islam. There are words in Arabic that are so entrenched with Islam that the minute you hear it, you know it. Okay. Then, when the Muslims were expanding and conquering other countries, they impacted what they call Islamicate languages. Urdu, Persian, Turkish, Albanian, Jawi, Yoruba. All of these languages, which became part of the Muslim civilization, submitted to Islam. They didn't necessarily become Arabic, but there was a lot of Arabic loanwords, Arabic script. Across the board, they submitted to Islam. What's interesting is by and large, the translations were very smooth. So Salah and Namaz, they translate smoothly. Okay, the ambiguity, there's not much there. Because over time, what these Islamicate languages did is they either embraced the vocabulary from Arabic or from the Quran and Sunnah, or they embraced the meaning, and over time they internalized. So these languages submitted to Islam. English didn't. English did not submit to Islam. Okay, so English as a language in of itself, which many of us speak, has not submitted to Islam. So Salah in English is prayer. It doesn't hold the same value, the same meaning. There's an ambiguity there. There's a problem, right? In that sense. And they call them modern languages. Modern languages are English, German, French. Okay? And these languages actually submitted to secularism. Right? And so there's a tension in the language. Anyone who speaks English, you can feel the tension regarding Islam. And I was joking with these guys the other day, but I told them when I hear nasheeds in Arabic or in Islamicate languages, it feels very comfortable. The minute I hear it in English, I get uncomfortable. So that sounds so cheesy. What's going on here? I just can't, I can't do it. Mahir Zain, I love him, but it's a friend of mine, but I can't do it. Right? So you start to realize there's something inherent in the language. Now, what some Muslim scholars try to do is they try to pump Islamic words into English. They tried it. And they're trying, but it's a challenge because what they're doing is individual endeavors. Whereas here, it was done, like I told you, from osmosis. The power was Islamic, the society was Islamic, the culture was Islamic, the languages became Islamic, the food became Islamic. I joke with my Turkish students all the time. I say, you see the food we eat in Muslim countries? It's Islamic. And they go, what do you mean? I said, burgers feel so abstract. It's a reflection of secularism. Eat your food on the go, keep moving. That's not part of our tradition. Our tradition was sit together, eat from one plate, right? Even the tools we use, a spoon. We have spoons in our hands, not knife and fork. It tells you something. So here, language becomes a major vehicle in the way you think. And Western academia is dominant because it writes in English. It writes in English. And you remember when I said to you about, when I said Allah says in the Quran, so I deliberately, in academia, don't say God. I say Allah. And because I teach Islamic studies, why do I have to say God? So a friend of mine goes, why are you insisting on this? So I said, because Allah is a supplication. It's not just his name. When you say Allah, you're rewarded for it. There's shifa in it. So when I go to an academic conference, this is what I do. I say, so those of you may not know this, but God means Allah. So I'm going to say Allah. And my friends laugh because usually we do the opposite. So you may not know, but Allah means God. So God says. And I say, Allah means God. Now you know Allah means God. There's no problem here. Allah says. Because I don't want to lose it. I don't want to lose it, right? So the point I'm making here is how powerful language is in that sense. So one of the things that I encourage you in regards to your children, teach them Islamic languages. They don't have to be Arabic. It's helpful if they are. But our Islamic languages, whatever they may be, still have enough Islam in them. So for example, when I'm giving dua to Allah Ta'ala, I don't do it in English. I do it in my mother's mother tongue. There's more ihtiram and respect in that language. I feel more comfortable doing it. The minute I start doing it in English, it's a bit difficult. Now, if you're only an English speaker, that's fine. It's not a problem. But the point I'm trying to make to you is that language is not devoid of power, culture, and history. Okay, in that sense. So what we need to do is we need to start producing knowledge in alternative languages as well. Okay, in that sense. Now, the good thing about me living in Turkey and even in the Arab world, a lot of translations are happening. Okay, in that sense, so there's a lot of this type of movement. But that was another point I want to make before we take a break. Do you guys have a question? Yes, please, sir.
Yeah, you brought up the conundrum of Turkish history,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a major one for the world, actually. And it's the reason for it being is that a lot of the information about the Ottoman Empire has been suppressed. A lot of the bad has been accentuated.
Right.
That's my reason for being here.
Thanks for coming.
But and I think that it's a missing link actually to a lot of the things that we're enduring today.
Yeah.
In terms of, as you said, going forward.
Right.
And not repeating the mistakes of the past, if you will.
Yeah.
So the Turkish language sources, I think it's important, as you said, to be able to interface with them, gain knowledge about them, and to explore their history. And I hope that you will, in the course of the program, talk about some of the texts that can be beneficial to the explorer.
Yeah. So what I would do in that sense is, I will make a list for you guys tomorrow of the possible books that you can access. Now, there is a different way of writing in Turkish than there is in English, but the big problem is the access to Ottoman texts. Ottoman is like Latin. Latin is a redundant language in that sense, right? And it sounds strange, but the Ottoman dictionary was 10 times bigger than the Turkish dictionary. The biggest letter in the Ottoman dictionary is mim, ma. Not a single word in Turkish begins with mim, ma. Not one. Every single word with mim is either Arabic, Persian, or foreign. Every single one. And Turks try to test me on this. They go, no, that's not true. And I say, well, give me a word. They go, Merve, that's Marwa. Mukammel, yeah, that's Arabic. Mustafa, yeah, that's not Turkish. And they start pulling it out, and then they'll go, okay, what about meow? I said, that doesn't count. Doesn't count. Okay, don't be like that. So what you start to realize is there was the sort of like attack on Ottoman Turkish was phenomenal. The only reason why Arabic survived is because of the Quran and Sunnah, because the attack was equal actually. There was attempts to try to Latinize Arabic and so forth, it didn't work out. Jawi, which is Malay in the Arabic script, became Malay written in English script, right? They're trying to revive Jawi, but it's tough. Ottoman had Turkish, same thing happened. Albanian, same thing happened. So many languages this happened. I was reading a text in India, it's a local dialect of Telugu, which was written in the Arabic script. So even those societies, Muslims were writing in Arabic. What's interesting is my mom and dad my dad's from India, my mom's from Pakistan, and they speak a language called Sindhi. My mom writes it in Urdu, and my dad writes it in the Gujarati script. It's really intriguing because there's no script for it. It's a vernacular that you only speak. But what you realize in that sense in Islamic societies is the Arabic script was a default. And in Ottoman, they were trying to increase the letters by using more Arabic letters. But when the language purge happened, and then the alphabet reform happened, that totally decimated that. And that's the problem, which is that getting hold of that resource now means you have to be able to you have to learn Turkish first, and Ottoman Turkish, and understand the Arabic script. And that's that's a huge challenge for many students, and many don't want to invest in that. Yeah.
And how did they move a Muslim?
Well, at the time they knew how to do it, right? This happens in the 1930s. So this is the key.
So much sway over the world.
Yeah.
In terms of even in scholarship.
Yeah.
Even in
we'll talk about we'll talk about that tomorrow. You're right. Yeah, we'll talk about that tomorrow. And this is actually important in terms of how that combustion happens and so forth. I mean, forget that. Look at Andalusia, right? Andalusia. Like when I go to Andalusia, my heart breaks. You see these buildings and the people don't resonate with the buildings. I went to a Burger King and they're selling alcohol. And what's going on here? I didn't even know they could do that. Is that possible? And then you turn around and you've got like the Alhambra right there, right? And I remember when I was in the Alhambra, I was walking around and the tour guide, she kept going, and these people, they came and they did this, and these people did that. And after about 30 minutes, I go, excuse me, who are these people? And she goes, the Muslims. I said, oh, okay. And so you start to realize how ingrained it becomes. So I think these are also moments where we should learn from that we're not going to be here forever. Our nations are not going to be forever. We're not an ultimate power. And even Muslims who are around for 600 years, for 400 years, they can be wiped out just like that. The good thing about Islam, unfortunately, unlike the Native Americans or so forth, things like that, is that Islam was spread across a larger space around the world. So if one group of people are obliterated, the knowledge remains somewhere else. But this is still happening today. Look at the Uyghurs, look at the Rohingya, look at India. These are modern forms of genocidal activities in which those people will lose their traditions and so forth. And you can see it in Palestine as well. So in that sense, so extreme moments of trauma and extreme moments of violence have created extreme moments of collective memory loss. And we can see this with the transatlantic slave trade. I was listening to a session by Dr. Sherman Jackson. And he was showing that the early Muslim slaves knew Arabic, and then it was beat out of them where the same person no longer remembered Arabic and started to write in English. That's what violence does, right? And the Muslim world has gone through that. So colonialism was exceptionally violent. Yes, sir.
With regard to the resurgence of Ottoman, is that something that is actively happening in Turkey?
So in Turkey, a lot of people are now starting to study Ottoman studies themselves because they're going beyond, if your history stops at 1924, so the modern period, what it does is it has the birth of the nation, Republican Day, on Monday you'll have President's Day or whatever it is. You create these events to keep your memory conception kept in this little box that this is it. I always say to people, my friends who are Palestinian, I said, unfortunately what's happened to you is that your identity has been constructed in opposition to the Israeli identity. It's a contest between you and them. You had an identity that went before the creation of the state of Israel. You were here before that. So what is your identity? You are part of Bilad Sham. It goes longer than that. And Muslim academics in Palestine actually write about, they call it Islamic Jerusalem continuously, right? As a way of linking beyond the now in that sense. So in the case of Turkey, you can't just stop it off when you're walking down the street and you see a masajid that's from like 500 years ago. So the society in some ways compelled because, it's in front of them. And there are many people who are learning Ottoman Turkish in Turkey, but we don't have many Muslim students who invest in that. And that may be difficult, and that's okay. But then there can be different ways of collaborating. We can work with our Turkish colleagues or so forth. So can we write works? These are the questions we're asking. Because I have a lot of Turkish friends who come to the States and they don't know how to teach Ottoman history to non-Turks. They don't know how to do it because they're used to teaching to their own people. And in Turkey, people just know. They're learning from high school, right? In that sense. So that could be an option. Okay. You have a question? Yes, sure.
So like in the canopy secularism,
Yeah.
then if the English language is not submitted to Islam,
Yeah.
then like if you're just kind of making the kids go and study the system, are we not putting them into already a state of compromise after that?
Yeah, of course it is. This is a challenge, isn't it? When schooling was created, schools were created to indoctrinate children to adhere to the national program. That is the success of modernity. Now, one of the problems that schooling is having now is the internet is killing it. But popular culture and so forth is doing the same thing. So then what did Muslim parents do? They tried to create Islamic schools as an alternative. But because it's at its infancy, it's difficult to know what the outcome of that will be. But even when kids go to Islamic schools, once they leave the schools, and once they leave their parents' home, and once they get to university, now there's a problem. And in the United States, I can say that the unraveling happens at university level, right? It's not happening at the primary school level, right? Whereas in other societies, it could happen earlier because of that. So you've safeguarded your children until the age of 17, 18, 19. But once they go to university and they want to feel like everyone else, that's where the problem is. And that's what I'd say to you as a parent, you who are parents, is once your kids go to university, don't abandon them, still remain connected to them. Okay? Don't just assume they're going to school, they're going to become rich, they're going to become famous, education is going to help them. Because education doesn't give them that emotion that you still give them as parents. They have to have that parental commitment of being connected. And parents in that sense have to have a good relationship with their children so that their children feel comfortable continuously being active with them, so that once they go to university, we don't lose them. That's hard. I'm not denying that. Some people don't have parents, but then we have to create communal spaces. Encourage our kids who go to university to come to our local communal spaces, right? And not have this distinction between kids who go to university and kids who go to communal spaces. But for now, you're right, it's a challenge and it's going to be hard. And that means we have to work twice as hard to protect them and save them, for sure. Anything else? Okay. We have 45 minutes left in the session. Okay, cool. All right. So let's go back to what I was saying. All right, so what I wanted to do before we talk about the early Ottomans then, is I wanted to talk to you about what came before the Ottomans. All right, in that sense, because the only way you can understand the Ottomans is if you can understand what came before them. So people were asking me yesterday many questions about Hagia Sophia. And one gentleman in particular came to me and he was very upset at the fact that Hagia Sophia, which was a church, had become a mosque. And he says, this is against Islam, what's happened here? And I said, you need to understand what was happening before as a way of understanding how this became a accepted tradition in the region by both Muslims and Christians. And I said to him quite politely, I said, don't you turn churches into mosques in America? And he goes, but nobody uses them. And I said, well, who was using Hagia Sophia once they were defeated? Nobody. And then he went, but it's different. I said, okay, in Turkey today, we don't have any Christians. Who's using it? So why can it not be a mosque? And what was strange for me, in fact, was that it was more palatable to accept that that building ought to be a museum than for it to be a mosque. Because the idea of the museum, it's secular, it's neutral, it's fair. And I think, well, that's strange. And so what I'm saying to you, once again, is all of this that I'm highlighting to you is coming from this space, right? And that's something that we have to be aware of in that context. So I tried to politely then say to him, I said, okay, if you want us to give Hagia Sophia back to the Christians, would you like us to give Aqsa back to the Jews? Is that what you're going to do? But that's different. I said, why is it different? In that sense, what you see is people's opinions can be quite skewed at times because they're living in the present and they're seeing everything from the prism of the present. That I said, you're not imagining what that was like at that time. You're not understanding what that was like. He goes, but Fatih came and he did blah, blah. Said, how do you know? Were you there? Did you see it? How do you know that? So one of the things that I want to explain to you here now is the idea of imagination. About how you imagining things. How is your imagination working? So I'll give an example. Someone said to me recently, they said, is it true that the Ottomans legalized homosexuality in 1856? And I said, well, where does it say that? He goes, the Islahat Farman in 1856. So I asked him, have you read it? He goes, no. So how do you know? He goes, well, I read a document and I went on Wikipedia and that's what it says. So then I asked him, I said, do you know, why would they legalize it in 1856? He goes, because the pressure of the British. The British made them do that, because the Ottomans were they were in decline and they were being colonized and the British put pressure on them and they legalized it. So when did the British legalize homosexuality? He goes, I don't know. I said, 1970. If the British legalized homosexuality in 1970, why would they force the Ottomans to do it in 1856? It doesn't make sense. Do you even know what Britain was like in 1856? It was conservative Christian. The British were very prudish. They were going to nations and making them cover up head to toe. They were critiquing the Muslims and making fun of the Muslims in regards to these people are loose, they're open, blah, blah, blah. They were very restricted in terms of their missionary activity. There's no way that the British would have encouraged the Ottomans in 1856 to legalize homosexuality when not a single country in the world did that. So I'm asking you again, why do you think that happened? The reason being is because the idea of time in his mind was skewed. His imagination was today. His understanding of the West was today. His understanding of Britain was today. And he assumed that the Britain we're talking about today is the same Britain of 1856. It wasn't. We say this in England all the time, that the soldiers in World War I that were fighting for your freedom were not fighting for LGBT rights. They wouldn't have known what that was. It didn't exist for them. That's not the freedom they were fighting for. They were very conservative people, by the way, fighting these wars. So in that sense, the point I'm trying to highlight to you is this idea of imagination. How you imagine in the past. And often the way we imagine the past is from as I said, the prism of the now in terms of what we experience today, because we're unable to understand. So if any of you have been to Turkey, they've built a giant mosque, which is called Çamlıca Cami. It's huge, absolutely humongous. And a lot of people, including the Turks, assumed that monumental mosques is what the Ottomans did as a way of reflecting imperial power. That we are the Ottomans, we are powerful, we're going to be a giant mosque. That's not true. The Ottomans built monumental mosques because they were madrasa complexes. Okay, so you have a giant mosque here, and then a madrasa complex around it, and students are studying in that complex, and when it's time for salah, they all go into the mosque, and then they go back. But now when you go to Turkey, you can't see the madrasas because they're cafes and coffee shops. You just see the giant mosque. And so your imagination assumes that they were just building giant mosques and spending money and wasting it to show the world that they were magnificent. They did that, but those, by and large, were madrasa complexes. Now, when you go to Çamlıca, there's no madrasa complex. It's not there. What's interesting when they built Çamlıca as well is that the minarets, 2 minarets were 1071, and the second minarets were 1453. So the Manzikat, and which is the Seljuk conquest, and 1450 Fatih's conquest of Istanbul. So I said to my Turkish friends, but these are not Hijri dates, these are colonial dates. What happened there? Once again, the imagination was colonized in this way that they're looking at the world and looking at the past and looking at ideas which they think are of the past in this prism of the now. Okay, because so much of the past has been extracted from them. So our memories are like a bit like Dutch cheese. I don't know if you know what Dutch cheese is. It's cheese with lots of holes in it. Dutch Edam, right? You see them in the Tom and Jerry cartoons. Big piece of cheese with big holes in it. That's what our memories have become. Memories of huge holes in it, in that sense. We need to fill them up again, in that sense. So this is the last point I wanted to make in terms of imagination. But okay, now I'm going to go on to the Seljuks. You guys have a question? No? I'm gonna get biceps at the end of this. All right. So, okay. So one of the interesting things is, before we can understand anything about the Ottomans, we need to understand the lineage of where they've come from, right? And I was thinking about this long and hard and saying, we've got 600 years of history. How much of it can I give you? And I thought, but this is important. This is an important point in that sense. And one of the things we learn is that the Turkic peoples, actually the first interaction with Turkic peoples happens very early on in the late Umayyad period, early Abbasid, Turkish tribe by the name of Suli, which is a very Chinese name in many ways, right? And then later on, we start to see in the latter Abbasid period, we start to see the emergence of Turkic people. And here, one of the interesting things is we start to see the emergence of Turks who are nomadic tribes. So when the Mongols are pushing more and more towards the west, the Turks who are getting caught up in the Mongol invasion are also moving more and more west as a way of trying to survive that sort of movement. But in fact, the Abbasids took in Turkish slaves as a way of having a military. Okay, and the reason they did that is because in the Abbasid states, there was a lot of like internal rivalries and internal coups between brothers. So as a way of making sure that didn't happen, they had a force or a slave force that they took from the outside, who they paid as a way of protecting them. And as time went by, that slave force became a power in of itself, right? Because what's intriguing here is that slaves were not being taken in to work in the farm. Slaves were being taken in to be military soldiers. You're giving them weapons. You're giving them power. So once they have the access to that power, the possibility is that power can take you out of power, right? In that sense. Now, the early Turks then, they come from a tribal system, but these tribes were then created in confederations. And the idea of creating these tribal confederations was that if one tribe went to war with another tribe, it would be a headache because you're part of a confederation. And if you're going to war with me, then you're going to war with all of these people as well, right? And this happened even in the time of Rasul Sallam. You see the way the tribes went together. That if you're fighting my tribe, or my tribe's with this tribe. In some ways, this is a mechanism designed to try to restrict internal conflict, okay? So they had these like pressure moments as a way of stopping these internal conflicts. But in Turkish, the Oghuz tribe is assumed that it came from the lineage of Oghuz Khan, okay, in that sense. And the Seljuk tribe is known as the origins is so I've written that in Turkish, so the dots are not there. The Kunuk tribe, which they say he was one of the sons of Oghuz, okay, in that sense. Now, in terms of the Turkish tribes, it's a lot harder, unlike the Arab tribes, to have documents that can prove to us with any concreteness of what was taking place, because the only people that we write about is power. So if you're not powerful, if you're just emerging, no one's going to write about you, and you're not going to write about yourself. And we can see this in the case of the Seerah of Rasul Sallam. When he's young, before Nubuwwah, before Wahi, there's very little, there's huge jumps, time skips, we call them, right? When he was like this as a child, then 15, and so forth. But once he receives revelation, he becomes a prophet. he becomes important for the people at the time. Everyone is documenting about him, right? And it's the same thing I want you to understand in terms of tribes and so forth, because people ask me about Ertugrul. And I say, he wasn't famous. Because he wasn't famous, very little was written about him in that sense. But because very little was written about him, you can make a wonderful show about him in that sense, right? In that sense. And that show, look, I always say to people, while as a historian, I can be critical about many things, but what was interesting about the show is it gave a sense of izzah back to Muslims, right? And you can see in that sense how Muslims felt. And they were drawing into the past. And Muslims resonated with it because to some degree, instinctively, we know that if we are good people and we are part of the Ummah of Rasul Sallam, then surely the people of the past who brought us this deen would have behaved in a similar way. So it resonated with us. It made sense to us in that sense, right? All right. So it's in, let's do it like this. So I have a notebook because I have a really bad memory. The older I'm getting, the more I'm forgetting about my life. The Seljuks accepted Islam in 1009, okay? And they were asked to help against the Karhanids. In 1037, they conquer Merv, M-E-R-V. In 1038, Nishapur. And then the Battle of Dadan Khan in 1040, the Seljuks sort of become internalized in the Khorasan, which would be today's Iran, Afghanistan region, right, in that sense. And they become a regular feature, right? And the way that their system works is a sort of like collective sovereignty. It's a very interesting way of doing things. So you have Turul Bey and Chara Bey. So in Turkish, this gay, they call them gay mushakke, which is like this side, you swallow it, it elongates. This is why.
Can you help us visualize where they're coming from and where those cities are that you mentioned?
Yeah, okay, sure. Yeah. Sure.
Seljuks,
Yeah.
were they primarily Mongols?
No, okay, good stuff. All right, so the Seljuks were not Mongols, they were Turkomen. So what we have in the Far East, so areas like China and so on, you have large Chinese populations. Yeah. Yeah, so this is what I'm going to explain. So then you have the Mongol areas, and then you have just beyond that, Turkish peoples. Now, as they're moving, as the Mongols are shifting this way, the Turks are also shifting this way. And so the Turks are generally, they're a buffer to some degree to the Mongol movement, right? So they're on the outskirts. So the more the Turks are coming, the rest of the world should have known that the Mongols are coming because they can see that migration coming eastwards in that sense. But that's not the only reason why the Turks were moving. Many Turks saw opportunities of land, of pastures, of a new area to settle in and so on. So they were moving westwards in that sense. And they moved into the area of what we would call today's Iran, Iraq, and fundamentally Afghanistan, and parts of Turkey, which is they call Anatolia. So that's the main part they sort of shifted into. And they started to have a presence in that area. And gradually, slowly, not only there, but places like the Caucasus in Russia, so southern Russia, Dagestan, today's Dagestan, Chechnya, and so on, you start to see a Turkic presence. And what's intriguing about these Turkic peoples is that the way that Islam came to them, it came through a Persianate style. This is why they use words like namaz, abdest for wudu. And so all the words they're using for ibadat are not Arabic, but they're Persian, indicating that Islam came to them via a more Persianate culture, which would be in the area of Iran and Afghanistan and so forth, right? And a lot of the literature they may have been reading, although I'd be reluctant to say they were reading literature at that time. These are military men. And the interesting thing about the Seljuks, and we'll talk about this later, is the Seljuk leaders are Turkish, and their peoples and the ulama are Persianate. So like Imam Ghazali, Nizam al-Mulk, right? So you have this very interesting component here. It says that the Turkic peoples then start to rule over a majority Muslim area, and they start to evolve. And you will start to see even the change in the names. Tuğrul, Çağrı, Alparslan, these are very Turkish names. And then Malik Shah. The kids start to be given Persianate names. So they're starting to become amalgamated with the people that they're ruling over. So in the same way as how the Mongols became Muslim, the Turks over a slower period of time, but an earlier moment, were becoming Muslim in the same way, in that sense, right? And it's interesting because like namaz, actually the word namaz and namaste is from the same root word. So namaste is to bow. So namaz is the act of bowing, right? In that sense. So you can see that they're moving in that sense. And actually it wasn't just Turks, and we have to make this clear. There were Kurds, there were Mongols, there are many different types of people that are moving along with them. Unfortunately for Kurds, there isn't a history about explaining their presence in the region along with the Turks in that sense, because generally we write about power, because power has the capacity to speak for itself, right? And we talk about Salahuddin being a Kurd and so on, but you know that's how it is working. So Merv, Nishapur, these are areas in what you'd call today's Iranian stroke Iraq area. They're over there, right? And what's interesting is the Abbasid Caliphate had to recognize in 1040 the existence of the Seljuks, right? And it's interesting because in 1058, Tuğrul Bey meets Mawardi, the famous Mawardi, the alim Mawardi, right? And Mawardi, when he's conceptualizing his idea of the Khilafah and the idea of the Sultanate, he's conceptualized it in mind of the Seljuk presence. Question?
It's a very one-on-one question.
Yeah.
Just so I visualize it. So it's the Seljuks, and then within that is the Oghuz.
No, so the Oghuz tribe is just, so the Seljuks are an extension of the Oghuz tribe. Okay, so the idea is there was a confederation. So some people say the Oghuz is actually the name of the confederation, not a person or a tribe. And some people say it's a tribe, and some people say it's a person. In that sense, there's difference. I would lean towards it's a name of a confederation. And these group were known as Oghuz tribe. But when we go to Ertuğrul, for example, Ertuğrul is known as being part of the Kaya tribe that has the lineage to the Oghuz confederation, in that sense, right? And what's interesting is people didn't know what the Kaya tribe was. So when Bayezid, and we'll talk about this later, when he goes to war with Timurlane, and he says, I am Bayezid, son of Osman Ghazi, part of the Kaya tribe. And Timurlane goes, what's the Kaya tribe? I'm Timurlane, descendant of Genghis Khan. So you can see like how lineage gives you authority and power in those days, right? In that sense. And the Kaya tribe's popularity is because, once again, of the TV show. But at that time, it would have been a very small tribe. And the reason why we know this is because when the Ottomans become the Ottomans, the name of the Kaya tribe seems to just phase out, right? And they construct their own identity based on that. And another interesting thing that you'll understand is that in terms of the Ottomans, Osman Ghazi would not have called himself the Ottoman. It's probably his son Orhan Ghazi who then named the Ottomans after his father. That's what he's done, right? So in that sense, we learned that Orhan Ghazi is actually the one who's probably doing the main activities, and then I'm going to name this after my father. That's why they became the Ottomans, in that sense. Yeah, they have a similar lineage. Yeah, this is the thing. So there are some differences, but yeah, that's right. And so people say in terms of Timur as well, that he has some Turkic lineage and so on. And actually, when we talk about later about the Mongol presence in Anatolia, you see, like today, like there must be people who are of Mongol extraction in Turkey, but they just say they're Turks, and we can't tell the difference, in that sense. And one of the interesting things is that in 1055, Tuğrul Bey, he sort of is invited to Baghdad to meet the Khalifa, okay? And there's an attempt to try to marry Tuğrul Bey with the daughter of the Khalifa. The reason being is because the Abbasids were very worried that the Seljuks are going to take him out. So one of the ways of trying to restrict the Seljuks from taking out the Abbasids is to try to have a connection with marriage. And this is one of the things Imam Ghazali was also recommending, and Nizam al-Mulk, the idea that the Seljuks should intermarry with the Abbasids as a way of protecting the two sultanates. But the Abbasids were a little bit nervous because they thought if we intermarry, we're going to lose our lineage, we're going to lose our identity, the Seljuks are going to take over. So there's an advantage of marriage, and then there's a disadvantage to marriage, right, in that context. And here, the Seljuks, they became known as okay, so Tur al-Bay gets known as Sultan al-Mashriq al-Maghrib, right? Well, Maghrib, sorry. It should be. Okay. And it's interesting that the Seljuks now are now being recognized as a sultanate, okay, and that this title of being a sultan is being given by the caliph, the Abbasid caliph, in that sense, as a way of giving him recognition, okay. And people often ask me about the hadith of Rasul about being part of the Qurayshi tribe. We start to see it being pronounced once again in this moment. So the first time we see that hadith becoming quite popular in Islamic history is when the Abbasid revolution happens. It's a way for the Abbasids to legitimize their rule over the Umayyah. So when they remove the Umayyah, they say, we are also from the Quraysh, we can be the Khalifa, we are from Abbas. That also, he is an uncle of the Prophet, so the Shia had to back down, the Alids had to back down, the Umayyah had to back down, and one size fits all. But in this moment, when the Seljuks are becoming powerful, but the Seljuks are also becoming religious, there's a nervousness. They say, you can't be a caliphate because you're not from the Quraysh, you're Turkic, right? And we've got this hadith here to prove it. And so the Seljuks had to back off in that context because the possibility of the Seljuks just going down south and taking them out could have happened, because we know that in the Ottoman Empire, Selim goes right down to Cairo and removes the Mamluks. So in that sense, you can see that this evidence was necessary in that time. And a lot of people in the area of Khorasan were Shafi'is anyway. This is one of the things when we talk about Nizam al-Mulk. Nizam al-Mulk was Shafi'i and the Seljuks were Hanafi. So your administration are predominantly Shafi'i scholars, and your power is Hanafi in that sense. And so one of the questions I was asking me yesterday is, why were they Hanafi? The chances are, we really don't know the information, but a lot of the guesstimates that Turkish scholars say is that Islam came to them via Madhab Hanafi, and they didn't see the Islam as Hanafi, Shafi'i, Maliki. They just thought Hanafiism was Islam. Okay, so they embraced it as Hanafis, internalized it, and then that just became part of their identity, and they just ran with it. And then they started, when they were in power, they were using Madhab Hanafi as a way of sort of like expressing themselves in that sense. Do you guys have any questions?
From a historical perspective, then like when you got the four Khalifs,
Mm-hmm.
and then like comes the Umayyad and Abbasid.
Yeah.
During the Abbasid period is like when the Seljuks.
That's right. Yeah. So we have so the Khulafa, so Rasul Sallam Khulafa Rashidun, then the Umayyah, and the Umayyah split into two, with the Sufyanids and then the Marwanids, then the early Abbasids, and then near the middle end of the Abbasid period, we start to see the emergence of the Seljuks in 1037, 1038. So then we start to see that, yeah. And what's interesting is the early Abbasids, or the early Muslim practice of the Khilafah, was to just expand your territory. But now what we have in the sort of like Abbasid period is you maintain your center and you can allow confederations to exist around you. And to some degree that's helpful because they like become buffers. So if there's an outside attack, they are attacked first and we are still safe, right? So it's almost like, Texas being surrounded by all these states, and then all these states have to take the hit from people coming in, and Texas is still sitting there waiting, right? And that's how it operated in that sense. So this is what was taking place here. So it's a far more decentralized way. And so the Abbasids were satisfied with allowing other states to be sultanates as a way of recognizing and giving them some level of authority, so that one, those sultanates don't take them out of power, but two, that they have a sense of legitimacy in their own eyes, so that they can run their affairs in the way that they see fit.
You had mentioned that one of the things that happened with the Ottomans, with the Seljuks, they came Islamic.
yeah.
So I think usually we see when an outside power comes in, they tend to dominate the society.
Yeah.
But why are we seeing the inverse? Why is the society impacting the rulers as the opposite?
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think one of the things that we see, which is quite consistent of peoples at that time, not just the fact that they're Turks or they're Muslims, is that there's a recognition that you can't rule over a group of people by brute force. And especially if you're a group of people that's not civilizational, right? So in that sense, if you're a tribal group of people, your practice is generally a shamanistic, there's no doctrine, there's no culture, there's no tradition in that sense. And you come over a group of people and then you start to notice their sophistication. You start to notice they have practices, they have a language that they use, and they have ways of doing things and tradition. And if you want to rule over them, you have to start to replicate particular practices for those people to accept you as rulers. So we see this in the case of Fatih. When Fatih conquers Istanbul, one of the interesting things prior to Istanbul's conquest, they were nomadic. Dola meant from moving from one place to another. And so the capital city was moving. Once they conquered Istanbul, Fatih built a palace. Why? Because the people were accustomed to the Byzantine Empire ruling over them in that structure of having a palace. Fatih would not have been taken seriously as the ruler of the Byzantine people if he didn't do that. So you start to replicate the sort of culture of the places that you conquer as a way of being accepted by those people. And what's interesting as well is that if your society is a flourishing society, it's got a long tradition, a long history, and you come along and you're interacting with them, naturally they're going to rub off on you. It's the same with the Mongol invasion. This is how they become Muslim, right? So Islam has now got a long tradition there and a sophisticated tradition. And the Turkic peoples know that. And that's why I'm saying it's intriguing how the shift happens. But they also know, and because people often present the Mongols and at times the Turks as barbarians. You know, these people just came and are just crazy soldiers. Actually, they were sophisticated peoples that came over, saw what was going on, and then made the adjustments at that time. And so that's what's happening. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
Because of the Abbasids?
Yes, so
Because of their interaction with the Abbasids?
yeah, exactly.
Were very
Yeah.
sophisticated. It was a very
Yeah,
sophisticated Islam, and it became
that's
very,
that's right.
fluffy.
Yeah. So if you look at, for example, Nizam al-Mulk, who's like the Grand Vizier of the Seljuk state. So what the Seljuks have done is they've delegated to a group of administrators who are already there, who know how it happens. And Nizam al-Mulk's father was working for the Ghaznavids. So Nizam al-Mulk's lineage is already aware of how to do administration, how to do religion. So when the Seljuks come as a power, they're like, how do we run this place? So they've delegated. This is why you have the idea of the Grand Vizier. You don't have that prior, but now in the Turkic states, the idea of the Grand Vizier is quite common because it's the issue of delegation. You have a particular interaction and a particular administration, and you know how it functions, and you work on our behalf. And these people, Nizam al-Mulk is madrasa trained, he's an alim, right? Al-Ghazali is an alim. And so the people you're mixing with, they're of particular sophistication, of particular knowledge. And that's in any walk of life, you know? Like, even for me, like, sometimes we get people around me, and after they're spending 1 or 2 years around me, they start to talk like me and behave like me because I'm teaching them, interacting with them all the time. And the Seljuks are interacting with the Persianate world. They can't be independent from that anymore. And so this is the interesting thing about Islam in that sense, that even in the West, there's a recognition that you have to obliterate it civilizationally so that you hollow it out. And when it's hollow, then you can fill it with something else. This is why, like Afghanistan, Iraq, these are problems because you obliterate it, you smash it, and then you fill it with something else, right? But if you don't do that and you just turn up, and we've seen this with American soldiers, they've gone to Iraq and then converted to Islam, right? You start to see the way people behave, the way people act, and you start to see the civilization in them. It's only natural that you start to replicate that. And the Seljuks had come to an area where Islam was dominant. It was there, you know, and that's the same with the Mongols. They'd come to an area where Islam was already dominant and Islam was elevating them in that sense. So that's the interesting thing about them. Anything else? You ready to roll? Yeah. Okay. How much time do I have?
10 minutes.
Oh, 10 minutes. Okay. Just drink this. I should have wore a white shirt. I've got green on my shirt now. There you go. the story of my life. Okay, so the Caliph marries Chara's daughter. So what's interesting here about the Seljuks is Tughral and Chara are brothers. They don't try to kill each other. They actually try to rule together. Okay, they're very close and they rule together. Tughral has one part of the domains and Chara has the other part of the domains. They sort of create a confederation, which is quite in line with the way that we feel about our brothers and sisters today. In that sense, it's quite intriguing, right? And one of the interesting things is that you start to see the emergence, like I said, and the change of the Seljuk. So Tughral's daughter then afterwards, so sorry, Chara's daughter marries the Caliph, the Abbasid Caliph, and Tughral later, when his wife dies, he marries the daughter of the Abbasid Caliph. So there's an intermarrying on both sides. There's a way of creating a connection. What's interesting though is Tughral had asked in 1060, the offer to marry the Abbasid Caliph's daughter. He said no. It took him 3 years until he said yes. So you can see that it seems to be some sort of like push and pull factor and an increase of influence. And you got to remember that in those days, not even those days, even my mom, like marriages didn't happen because people fell in love. All right. This is a very modern phenomena. This is why in the Quran, Allah Ta'ala says, and be kind to your wives. Yeah. Kindness is a behavior, right? If you're kind to people, you naturally love them. But if you can love someone and be mean to them. So in that sense, what you start to learn is that people are not falling in love. There are some, like in the period of Harun al-Rashid, the story of Layla al-Majnun, where he's going crazy and Harun goes, who's this woman he's crazy about? Bring her over so that I can marry her. And then they bring over the woman, he goes, it's you, you're not even attractive. Like, what does he see in you? What's the deal, right? And then you have the famous line that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, in that sense. So he's like, what? Get him out of it. This guy's crazy. And but people never got married for those reasons. People got married for political reasons. People got married for all sorts of reasons, but love was very low on their priority list. And political marriages were really high. I mean, like, for example, my mom had an arranged marriage. She met my father on the wedding day. That was it. They got married, and they made it work. So tell that to the kids these days. They think you're crazy. There you go. So after Tughral Bey, as I said, we have Alp Arslan. And in 1071, Alp Arslan Manzikert in English. Yeah. In 1071, Alp Arslan defeats the Byzantines for the first time in the Battle of Manzikert, or Manazgirt in Turkish. And this is a game changer. Okay, the Byzantines are now seeing the movement of Muslims and Turkic peoples coming into Anatolia. What's interesting at this moment is the word Rum here, okay, does not mean Constantinople. Rumeli, and we use this in Ottoman history, we say Anadolu and Rumeli. Anadolu meaning Anatolia, and Rumeli meaning the European side, and it usually means from Bursa all the way to the end of the Balkans. But if you think of Mevlana Rumi, he's from Konya. How's that Rumeli? Because in those days, Konya was Christian before the Muslims came. And so Mevlana became Muslim, based on the fact that Konya became Muslim and he was from there. So the word Rum in of itself it's not clear, it's moving all the time. So for example, in English, they say all roads lead to Rome. That actually means Istanbul, not Rome in Italy, because all roads do lead to Rome, right? And it was known as the Eastern Roman Empire. So even the term Rumeli, it has a capacity of shifting throughout history. So when we're looking at the history as Muslims and they use the word Rum or Rumeli, or like the Sahaba whose name was al-Rumi, it doesn't necessarily mean they're coming from Europe that we understand today, right? In that sense, it has that component. And so the Byzantines in Anatolia, large stretch, are defeated by the Turks. And it's a real game changer. We start to see, and in Turkey, why this is important? Because in Turkey, they talk about this as the arrival of the Turks on today's Turkish soil. This is a reimagination for them. Nobody celebrated 1071 historically before. But when I was in Turkey, I'll tell you this now, 10 years ago, 1071 was not part of the Turkish imagination. It's in the last 5 years that we're now celebrating all of these things as a way of highlighting the Turkish presence in the region, right? As a way of feeling a sense of Turkish pride, a sense of Turkish nationalism, and so forth, right? And then 72. (1072), you have the last great sort of like Seljuk leader, Malik Shah. Yeah, and it's under Malik Shah that you have Nizam al-Mulk al-Ghazali, and he rules until 92. Wait, I wanted to highlight something. Now, if you look at the timeline here, the land span, it's quite interesting. So they arrive at 1038, 1092. They've had 1, 2, 3, virtually only 3 rulers who've ruled over like an 80-year span. That's a long period of time. In today's day and age, if a president's around more than 8 years, we go crazy. So it's interesting that in that period of time, it's remained in sort of one household, one tribe. And that prolonged period of time has allowed them to consolidate their culture and identity because they've been in power over this stretch. And what I want you to understand is when we're teaching history is to see the gaps in time, actually count the numbers. Because what we do is we just go 1038, 1039, and we feel like these are just like 5-minute intervals. These are long stretches. And the reason why I want you to understand that is that when people were becoming Muslims, when people were converting to Islam, when the areas were gradually changing towards Islam, it was a slow process. It didn't happen overnight. So when you ask yourselves, how long have we been in the United States of America? Understand that you've been here shorter than that process. And there's just 3 rulers there, right? So in that sense, you start to understand that civilizationally, Islam, when it came to a place, it was a slow burner. It came gradually. Yes, there are battles and so forth, but it's not happening every day. They're not just people that are fighting every day. They'll go to war, they'll expand, consolidate. Wait, expand, consolidate. And it took a particular moment of time. And then you see, this is how Islam is not a civilizational destroyer. It's a civilizational builder, okay? So we didn't just come and destroy. We came, we gave, and we took our time over it. And that's what you see in this moment here. And I wanted you to understand that, because when we talk about the Ottomans, we see this. Okay. It's at 1156 that the Seljuks are at their weakest. And while the Seljuks are at their weakest point, we start to see the increase of the Mongol invasion at its strongest point. And the Mongols have decided to come towards Anatolia in that sense, okay? And this is quite intriguing to see that. Now, if you see that burn, and there's a lot of leaders after that, but it's still a long time in that sense. It doesn't happen overnight. And then you start to see the emergence of the Mongol Ilkhanids that start to arrive in the region in that sense. Any questions? No? Yes, go for it. 1092 is the end of Malik Shah's reign. Yeah, 1092 is the end of Malik Shah's reign in that sense. So he's in power for 20 years. Okay, and in those days, you got to understand so people always ask me, like, in Islam, why do we have like this dynastic mindset? How comes we don't have elections and so forth in the Khulafa Rashidun? The reason for that is because, and it starts off with Muawiyah and Yazid actually, which is when Muawiyah is in power in Damascus, by now a large body of the Muslim population has either died, especially the Sahaba. So, okay. So as a result of it, what you start to see is that the Islamic rulership has expanded over a large landmass, and there's various areas like Iraq, Egypt, Hijaz, Bilad al-Sham that are part of this domain, and a way of creating continuity. Because elections would create, there's no elections. The minute the caliph dies, somebody else wants to challenge and there's warfare. So there's a way of stopping that and a way of maintaining continuity. Say, after I die, I want him to be in charge. And he's my son, and I know what I was doing, and he knows what I was doing. So why don't we just keep him there? Of course, there's an emotional component to it as well, in that sense. But the idea is, so when we see in the case of Marwan II, when Marwan is being asked to come to Damascus to be caliph because he's part of the Umayyad, he said, okay, so me, then after me, my son, then after my son, him. He's putting a plan down. So because why? Because when Muawiyah dies, a year later Yazid, and then 6 months later Muawiyah II dies. Boom, boom, boom. Within 2 years, 3 Khalifas of the same household are gone. So then as a way of maintaining continuity, so there's no extended warfare, they created these sort of like dynastic, sort of like, environments to maintain continuity. The problem is now, as historians, we can see that was a problem. Okay, that what problems they create, but at the time they didn't see it like that. That lineage was important. Maintaining authority and power in lineage was important because people, they took their authority from the fact that you were from an important lineage. So they will say, for example, I'll give you a very primitive example. I go to the halal butcher because your dad used to be a good butcher here and I know that you follow his practices, right? If you're going to be in charge of us, your father was a good man, you're part of that tribe, you can treat us the same. And the tribe would tell the son that you have to work in accordance to the way your father was doing it. And the aunts, I'm serious, the aunts, the uncles, the mothers, and what are you doing? Behave yourself. Your father was like this, you rule over your people like that. So there is an internal dynamic, a culture within the politics as well. And this is why they're able to maintain this longevity and why it stays in these particular households in Islamic history. Now, because of modernity, we can have these elections and votes and so forth. That would have been impossible in those days. Absolutely impossible. So what you do is usually, the locality, you just, to maintain continuity, because let's just say somebody dies in Damascus, the time the news gets to Mecca, it's going to be days. He's dead, the next one's in charge. Keep rolling. Just continuity. So this is what we're seeing here, the Seljuks as well. In terms of the tribal system, the advantages of the tribal system is this. And in some ways, it sounds bizarre, but tribalism in some ways is a lot more humane than nationalism. At least there's code of conduct. These are my blood. These are my people. I'm going to operate like this. There's an emotion. I know who they are. I belong to them. They're like family. I'm not agreeing with tribalism, but I'm saying in that sense, tribalism in a strange way, you can understand why Ibn Khaldun was willing to give tribalism the time of the day. Whereas nationalism is strange. You don't know who lives in California. You don't know who lives in Hawaii or in Alaska. How are they your people? How do you have that connection? It's invisible. It's in the imagination, right? And as a result of that, unless if you heavily keep pushing the idea that you're all American in the minds of people, you don't have that attachment. Whereas here, the tribalism still has a stronger bond. And that's how it works. So in some ways, people say that nationalism is an extension of tribalism. It may be, but tribalism is still a far more like what you can call instinctive, like stronger bond in many ways. And that's why today, now, still in parts of India, Pakistan, and the Arab world, tribalism is still there. Okay, and there's a code of conduct when you belong to that. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just trying to help you understand why they still exist.
Okay.
Very well?
Yes, let's have a break.
Okay.
We'll be back in 12:15.
All right. So far, you guys all right, yeah? Okay. If I see you falling asleep, I'll know. I can see all of you.